The purpose of this quick training module is to help define the relationship between the data items and the URIs in the Schema App Editor so that you can avoid some of the common mistakes people make. In the Schema App Editor, you'll be creating data items. I like to think of a data item as a bundle of information consisting of a schema.org type, also known as a class, and associated properties. Creating a data item is a two-step process. You can think of it as step one, labeling it, which is giving it a name that will be easily recognizable for you as you look through your list of data items. You want to provide a URL to tell the Schema App Editor where the markup should deploy to, and you want to verify or select the schema.org type or class. After you've done that, you want to describe the data item by defining the schema.org properties. So here we are, we've selected NGO as our primary schema.org type for this not-for-profit organization. And I'm going to start with step one, which is giving this data item a name, copying and pasting the URL to say, this is where I want you to deploy this NGO markup to, and verifying that the type should be NGO. And now I can move on to step two, which is describing all of the properties associated with this NGO. And of course, I'm only going to mark up content that's visible on the page. So there's different ways of defining these properties. You can copy and paste the text, you can create a nested or embedded data item, you can link to a data item you previously created for this project or customer, or you can link to a definition on the web, i.e. through Wikipedia or Wikidata. So copying and pasting text is pretty straightforward. Wherever you see enter text, then you're encouraged to go to the website and just copy and paste that on here. And if it's not visible, skip over that property, because one of the rules for schema.org is that you should really be only marking up content that's visible to a user. Now, this is where people get in trouble, is when they're nesting or embedding data items. So this is actually the exact same process as we did for the primary schema.org type or class. It's still a two-step process where you're going to want to label it and then describe it. So if, for instance, I was going to create a data item for the postal address, instead of putting in the text, you can see that the Schema App Editor is suggesting that you create an embedded data item to describe this property. Then I would click on that, I would select data item, and then I would label it, give it a name that's easily describable. I would define the URL that I want this schema markup to be deployed to, and then I'd verify that the schema.org type is in fact postal address. Now the thing is, though, that the URL of this postal address is the same as the URL of the NGO, which is my primary schema.org type. So the postal address is on that home page, and I want to tell the editor that it's on the home page, but I also want to explain the hierarchy as well as give this data item its own unique identifier. So the way the tool does that is it puts a hashtag after the URL of the page, and it defaults to whatever it's called. So in this particular case, hashtag postal address, but you're free to edit anything behind the hashtag to give it its own label. Then of course you press create and you're back to step two, which is filling in the properties for the postal address. Now the recommended and required properties are visible, or you might need to scroll down to see them. But if you wanted to describe some of the properties that aren't visible, you can open the full data item to define any of the properties available for this type. Now things can get a little confusing, which is why we put this video together, because you've got this data item that you've created, you're in the projects and you are defining the properties, and you may be linking to another data item, and that actually even a data item within that data item, and it can be a little bit like navigating through a maze. But if you remember that it's always a two-step process, we're going to label it or identify it and then define the properties, you'll be okay. In the end, this is what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to have the primary entity that describes the page as being the actual URL of the page that the markup is going to deploy to. But we also want to show all of the other things that are going to be nested below that, going to that same URL, but we put the hashtag in there to give it its own unique identifier, and also to help define the hierarchy, where the primary entity of the page is the NGO, but we also have an address, so we're nesting that below there. Now you can link to existing data items that you've previously created for this project or customer. So for instance, if I was creating a service data item, and I wanted to indicate that the provider of this service was the organization, then I can click on that field and the available instances will show up. And I could maybe select the first one, ABC Company. You can see how creative I was there. And that will bring that in, and then you can see the link to all of the fields that I would have populated for ABC Company. And lastly, you can link to a definition on the web, either Wikipedia or Wikidata, by typing in the thing that you want to look up, searching Wiki, and choosing the best description for your content. So anyhow, I hope that helps to clear up any of confusions around data items and nesting data items and URIs. The last thing to remember is that even if you've created all of this content within the editor, if you haven't actually created the implementation or the deployment method, then it won't go anywhere. It'll just reside in the tool. So that's one more thing to consider. And of course, if you need any assistance from us, please don't hesitate to reach out.